June 25, 1876, a day etched in blood and glory. The Battle of Little Bighorn, a pivotal clash between the United States Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment and the combined forces of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. Among the few who survived the chaos and carnage was Private John Ryan, a soldier who witnessed the unthinkable. In this rare and gripping eyewitness account, John Ryan shares his harrowing tale of survival, shedding light on the battle's most intense moments. Join us as we relive the Battle of Little Bighorn through the eyes of a soldier who lived to tell the tale. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. As we marched at a rapid pace, some of the packs became dislodged, so we severed the ropes and abandoned them. One pack belonging to my company was amongst them, and the Indians likely claimed them subsequently. We descended into a ravine and encamped temporarily without unsaddling our horses. We simply lay down, tossed the bridle reins over our arms, and slumbered, a common practice for cavalrymen on campaign. It appears that General Custer and some scouts had proceeded ahead and gathered intelligence regarding the Indian encampment. Upon Custer's return, the officers were summoned, and he issued directives concerning the battalion formations. We partook in a hearty breakfast, consisting of raw bacon, hardtack, and cold water, which we savored immensely. Here, General Custer divided the regiment into 3 battalions. The battalion under his direct command comprised Troop C, led by Captain Thomas W Custer, the general's brother; Troop I, led by Captain Myles Keogh; Troop F, led by Captain George W Yates; Troop L, led by First Lieutenant James Calhoun, General Custer's brother-in-law; and Troop E, led by First Lieutenant Algernon E. Smith. He entrusted another battalion of 3 troops to Major Marcus Reno, consisting of Troop M, led by Captain Thomas Henry French; Troop G, led by First Lieutenant Donald McIntosh; and Troop A, led by Captain Myles Moylan. The 3rd Battalion was commanded by Captain Frederick Benteen, comprising his own Troop H, Troop K, led by First Lieutenant Edward Godfrey, and Troop D, led by Captain Thomas Weir. Approximately 150 pack mules formed the pack train, escorted by Captain Thomas Moore McDougall with his own Troop B, and a detachment from each of the remaining 11 companies under the command of First Lieutenant Edward Matthey of Troop M. The pack train followed in Custer's wake and subsequently joined Reno's battalion on the bluffs, a most fortunate circumstance, as our ammunition was nearly depleted. We then traversed the divide, and Lieutenant Hodgson, adjutant to Reno's battalion, rode from the front to the rear, issuing orders to maintain a slight distance between companies, thereby avoiding the creation of a large dust cloud that would alert the Indians to our approach. Upon crossing the divide, we descended through a small valley and circled the base of the bluff. We espied several abandoned lodges, their entrances tied shut, and surmised that General Crook's command had engaged the Indians on the 17th, resulting in the demise of several chiefs, whose bodies were placed within these lodges, accounting for the secured entrances, although we were unaware of their contents at the time. I believe Custer prepared to charge the camp, mistaking it for an Indian encampment. From our vantage point, we could gaze down the valley and discern objects in the distance, uncertain whether they were Indians or buffalo. At this juncture, I understand that Custer directed Reno to pursue those Indians, promising support, although I did not personally hear the order. This marked the last sighting of Custer's battalion until the discovery of their bodies on the morning of the 27th. Custer led his battalion to the right, while Reno's battalion followed the valley down to the Little Bighorn River, and Benteen branched off to the left. Reno's battalion commenced its descent into the valley, initially at a trot, subsequently breaking into a gallop and marching in columns of 2s. Lieutenant Varnum, a valiant young officer commanding the scouts, rode ahead of Reno's battalion, waving his hat in the air and exclaiming, "30 days furlough to the man who secures the first scalp." We eagerly coveted the furlough, though we're less enamored with the notion of procuring a scalp. Upon reaching the banks of the Little Bighorn River, we waded across, encountering a formidable current and treacherous quicksand approximately 3 feet in depth. Following a brief halt on the opposite bank, during which we dismounted, tightened our saddle girths, and remounted, we formed into line, with Captain French's Company M on the right, Lieutenant McIntosh's company on the left, and Captain Moylan's in the rear. Thus arrayed, We proceeded down the valley, initially at a trot, then a slow gallop. A dense thicket of underbrush and blueberry bushes flanked the right of my company, prompting Captain French to order me to detach 10 men to form a skirmish line, thereby securing the brush from our right flank to the riverbank, as Indians might be lurking within. We advanced in this formation for a distance of 1.5 to 2 miles until we reached a dense copse of timber. Prior to arriving at the timber, a solitary shot rang out ahead of us. I was uncertain whether it originated from Lieutenant Varnum's scouts or a hostile Indian. That inaugural shot marked the commencement of the Battle of the Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, and my auditory faculties were particularly acute at that moment. Private James Turley, a member of my troop, lost control of his horse upon arriving at the timber, where we had been ordered to halt. The horse carried him towards the Indian encampment, and I never saw him again. He was a most pleasant young fellow. A trifling incident occurred a day or two prior to our departure from Fort Rice, when Turley requested permission to store some of his belongings in my clothes chest. I acquiesced, stipulating that should he fall in battle, the contents would become mine, and conversely, should I meet my demise, they would become his. Following our return from the expedition, the personal effects of the fallen men were sold at public auction, with the proceeds remitted to the paymaster. Upon reaching the timber, we hastily dismounted, with the fourth man in each group of 4 retaining control of the horses. We then ascended to higher ground, forming a skirmish line that stretched from the timber towards the bluffs on the opposite side of the valley, facing downstream in the direction of the Indian camp. This vantage point afforded us our first glimpse of the encampment. Some men lay prone, while others knelt, utilizing the mounds of a nearby prairie dog town as makeshift breastworks. As we established the skirmish line, the Indians launched their initial charge, approximately 500 strong, emerging from the direction of their village. Well-mounted and well-armed, they attempted to breach our line. We repelled their charge with volleys, emptying numerous saddles. Lieutenant Hodgson walked along the line, exhorting the men to remain calm and aim low. Ultimately, the Indians, unable to breach our line, resorted to a flanking maneuver, forming a single-file column and lying on the opposite side of their ponies from us. They commenced to encircle our position, overlapping our skirmish line on the left and closing in on our rear. We received orders to fall back to our horses, where the first casualty occurred, Sergeant Miles F. O'Hara of my troop, M. He had been promoted to sergeant just days prior, replacing Sergeant John Dolan, whose term of service had expired. Sergeant O'Hara was an exemplary soldier, and his loss was deeply felt. Later, during the destruction of the Indian camp, we discovered the gruesome spectacle of 3 of our comrades' heads, tied together with wire and suspended from a lodge pole, their hair burned off. Their bodies were not found, likely having been cast into the river. Upon returning to our horses, confusion ensued as some men struggled to locate their mounts. Major Reno, hatless and sporting a red handkerchief around his head, gave the order to mount. As I glanced rearward towards the river, I observed the Indians completing their encirclement, riding through the brush and lying flat on their ponies. I alerted Captain French, saying, "Captain, the Indians are in our rear." He responded, "Oh, no. Those are General Custer's men." In that instant, one of the Indians fired, striking Private George Lawrence of my company in the back of the neck, the bullet exiting through his mouth. He fell forward, dropping to the ground. The Indians then unleashed a hail of fire from all sides, prompting me to suggest to Captain French, "Our best course of action is to cut through them." By this point, we were surrounded, with the Indians holding the higher ground. Major Reno rode up, exclaiming, "Any man wishing to escape, follow me." The order to charge was given, and we ascended the steep embankment in a unified body, cutting through the Indian forces with Major Reno at the forefront. As we pierced their lines, the combat became intense and hand-to-hand, with certain doom awaiting any man who fell from his horse or was wounded and unable to keep pace with the command. After breaching their ranks, we retraced our steps and veered left to reach the bluffs at the nearest point, where fierce fighting ensued. The Indians surrounded us on all sides, their numbers seemingly endless. This charge claimed the lives of 30 men, including 10 from my company. Notable casualties included Bloody Knife, chief of Indian Scouts, Charlie Reynolds, a white scout, and Izar Dorman, the Negro interpreter. Lieutenant Hodgson suffered wounds and lost his horse, while Lieutenant Donald McIntosh, a brave and faithful officer commanding Company G, made the ultimate sacrifice. Meanwhile, Lieutenant DeRudio, Fred Gerard, a white scout, and approximately 10 to 12 men became separated from the command, seeking refuge in the brush, woods, or under the river embankment. Some of these men, including Sergeants Charles White and Patrick Carney of my company, later recounted their harrowing experiences, telling me they stood neck-deep in water beneath the embankment to evade the Indians. These men rejoined the command in the entrenchments on the bluff after nightfall. At this juncture, the river spanned approximately 50 yards in width, its waters reaching a depth of 2.5 feet, with a formidable current. Lieutenant Hodgson, wounded and his horse slain, requested assistance to cross the river. It was reported that Trumpeter Fisher, affectionately known as Bounce from my company, instructed the lieutenant to grasp his stirrup, and thus the horse conveyed both men across the river. Tragically, Lieutenant Hodgson was struck by a second bullet and succumbed to his wounds. I am aware of 3 individuals who claim to have assisted Hodgson in his final moments. The combat preceding our river crossing was fierce and intimate, with soldiers frequently discharging their revolvers directly into the breasts of the Indians. Upon depletion of their ammunition, some men discarded their revolvers and seized their carbines, lacking the time to reholster their sidearms. In my estimation, had Reno's command tarried in the timber mere moments longer, our entire force would have been annihilated, vastly outnumbered as we were by a ratio of 10 to 1. The opposite bank of the river presented a formidable obstacle, its steep incline necessitating ascent via a narrow buffalo trail, barely wide enough to accommodate a single individual. As we scaled the bluff, Dr. Dowolf, a contract surgeon attached to the expedition, fell to enemy fire, alongside Sergeant Clare of Company K, William D. Meyer, farrier of Company M, and Henry Gordon of the same company. Their bodies, along with several others, lay within the protective range of our firearms, denying the Indians opportunity to scalp them. Upon gaining the bluffs, we beheld the plains, where the Indians engaged in the gruesome acts of stripping, scalping, and mutilating our fallen comrades. The prairie was ablaze, and our officers strove to rally the men, even as many continued to fall. After the companies were formed, the firing ceased, and we were joined by Benteen's battalion, which was the first we had seen of him since the division of the regiment. Soon after, the pack train arrived, with Company B under Captain McDougall, which was very fortunate, as our ammunition was nearly exhausted, and we could not get supplies from any other source. We had several wounded men, and we attended to them as well as circumstances would permit. I understood at that time that Captain Weir, with his Company D, left the command there, and started in the direction General Custer took for a short distance, and then returned, although I did not see him. Leaving 2 companies with the packs and wounded, Major Reno, with 5 companies, or what was left of them, proceeded in the direction we had supposed General Custer took, and in the direction of the Indian camp. We went in that direction for probably half a mile until we gained a high point and could overlook the Indian camp and the battlefield. We saw at a distance of from 1.5 miles to 2 miles parties whom we supposed were Indians, riding back and forth, firing scattering shots. We thought that they were disposing of Custer's wounded men, and this afterward proved to be true. We halted for a few moments and saw a large herd of ponies at the further end of the village, and could distinguish a large party of Indians coming towards the Indian camp. The prairie around the village and the first battlefield was all afire, having been set by the Indians to hide their movements. At the top of this bluff, we halted, and at foot, there was a ford, and this was where Custer had first encountered the Indians, as we found some of the dead bodies there 2 days afterwards. While we were on the bluffs, the Indians again made their appearance, coming in large numbers from the direction in which we heard the firing. We exchanged several shots with them, and we lost a few men, and then had orders to fall back to our packs and wounded. Upon our arrival, we dismounted with all due haste, placing the wounded in a low depression on the bluffs and utilizing packs from the mules to shelter them from the Indian fire. We then formed a circle with our pack mules and horses, establishing a skirmish line around the perimeter and lay in wait for the Indians. We had occupied this position for only a brief interval when the Indians advanced in great numbers from the direction of our approach. They launched several charges upon us, each of which we repelled successfully. Ultimately, they surrounded us, and the firing became general along the entire line, rapid and at close range. The company to the right of mine suffered a significant number of casualties within a few minutes. A high ridge to the right and an opening in our lines presented a vulnerability, which one Indian in particular exploited with considerable skill. While we lay in line, he fired a shot that killed the fourth man to my right. Shortly thereafter, he fired again, striking the third man. His third shot wounded the man to my right, who retreated from the line amidst the wounded. I feared my turn was imminent. In response, I rose to my feet alongside Captain French and approximately half a dozen members of my company. Instead of firing directly to the front as we had previously, we wheeled to our right and unleashed a deadly volley, which I believe terminated the Indians' lethal endeavors, as no further casualties occurred at that specific location. Captain French was an exemplary officer, renowned for his bravery and marksmanship, having dispatched several Indians on various occasions. He wielded a Springfield rifle, caliber .50, breechloader, and customarily notched the stock upon each successful engagement. I recall an occasion when Captain French fired upon a curlew, discharging 2 or 3 shots, yet failed to strike it. He became so disheartened that he discarded the rifle. Later, I retrieved it, wrapped it in a blanket, and discreetly placed it in one of the government wagons, eventually bringing it to Fort Rice, Dakota, after the expedition's conclusion, unbeknownst to him. Upon discovering I had recovered his rifle, he reclaimed it. Regrettably, I have been informed that he met with a fatal accident after retiring from service. As night descended on the 25th, the engagement drew to a close. We set to work with the limited tools at our disposal, comprising 2 spades, our knives, tin cups, and even utilizing pieces of hardtack boxes as makeshift spades. We commenced constructing temporary fortifications and fashioned breastworks from boxes of hard bread, sacks of bacon, corn, and oats, blankets, and every available resource. During the night, ammunition and rations reached us within our entrenched lines, but we suffered greatly from the lack of water. Although the river lay mere 300 or 400 yards away, the Indians controlled the approach, thwarting our attempts to access it. Several men attempted to procure water under the cover of darkness, but were either killed or repelled. Around midnight, we heard a trumpet call, prompting our men to cheer, believing Custer's forces were arriving to reinforce us. Major Reno directed one of our trumpeters to respond with a call, but it went unanswered, leading us to conclude it was an Indian ruse to lure us from our defenses. The trumpet employed by the Indians likely belonged to one of Custer's trumpeters, though we were unaware of this at the time. We had no intention of abandoning our defenses, as several of our men lay wounded within, some grievously so. Throughout the night, we could hear the Indians riding to and fro across the river, leading us to suspect they anticipated a breakout from our position. On the morning of the 26th, 2 shots rang out in rapid succession just before dawn, signaling the commencement of another day's engagement. We remained uncertain about the fate of Custer and his troops. The battle soon intensified, with the Indians advancing en masse in an attempt to breach our lines. Captain Benteen's company faced extreme pressure, and the men valiantly endeavored to repel the Indians gaining ground. Captain Benteen urgently requested reinforcements from Major Reno, exclaiming, "The Indians are making a concerted effort to cut through my lines, and I fear I shall be unable to maintain my position much longer." In response, Captain French's Company M was promptly withdrawn from their section of the line and rushed to support Captain Benteen's beleaguered company. Both companies launched a charge against the Indians, driving them down the hill, though at the cost of several men. This particular sector of the battlefield lay slightly elevated compared to the surrounding terrain. Had the Indians succeeded in their endeavor, the day would have been lost, and Reno's command would have suffered the same fate as Custer's valiant men, as Captain Benteen later observed. During the charge, Private James Tanner of Company M was severely wounded and lay exposed on the side of the bluffs. A call for volunteers was made to retrieve him, and I, along with 3 others, hastened to his aid with a blanket. We carefully rolled him into the blanket and swiftly conveyed him to the area where our wounded were gathered. Fortunately, none of the rescue party suffered more than a few bullet holes in their clothing. After placing Tanner with the other wounded, he succumbed to his injuries within minutes. A gray horse, renowned as the finest buffalo horse in the command, belonged to my company and was ridden by Captain French. The horse was among the others near the wounded when an Indian shot it through the head. As it staggered among the other horses, Private Henry C. Voigt of my company attempted to lead it away, but was instantly killed by a shot to the head. We interred Private Tanner and Voigt in the same grave the following morning, fashioning a headboard from a hard tack box and inscribing their names with a lead pencil. As the day drew to a close, the Indian fire subsided, except for a few well-aimed shots from the crest of a high bluff in the direction Custer was believed to have taken. These shots felled several of our men. I am uncertain what type of firearm one of the Indians employed, but it produced a tremendous report, and their range exceeded that of our Springfield carbines, caliber .45. Captain French of my company inquired if I could effectively engage the Indians, as they were beyond the range of our carbines. I assured the captain that I would attempt to do so, utilizing my 15-pound Sharps telescope rifle, caliber .45, which I had commissioned in Bismarck prior to the expedition's commencement at a cost of $100. I fired several shots to gauge the distance, and once I had established the range, I rapidly discharged half a dozen rounds at the group of Indians. They promptly retreated from the bluff, and this marked the cessation of Indian fire in that memorable engagement, prompting our men to erupt in cheers. The Indians hastily departed the bluffs, crossing the river and returning to their encampment. We observed them dismantling their lodges, preparing for a swift departure. Shortly thereafter, they removed the hides from their lodges, leaving the poles standing, and vacated their camp, proceeding up the Little Bighorn Valley and traversing the battlefield where Major Reno's battalion had initially clashed with the enemy and where the dead lay. I had previously witnessed the collective movements of various tribes, including the Cheyennes, Arapahos, Kiowas, Apaches, and Comanches, in the Indian Territory in Kansas during my campaigns under General Custer. However, this gathering surpassed those in scale, with approximately double the number of Indians congregated. As they departed, Captain Thomas French and I continued to fire upon them with our rifles until they moved out of range, marking the final shots of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a fact well known to every man in Reno's battalion. Major Reno, Captain French, Captain Benteen, Captain McDougall, Captain Weir, Lieutenant Godfrey, and indeed all the officers exhibited unwavering dedication, doing everything within their power to vanquish the Indians. It is a testament to their fortitude that some of them escaped unscathed, despite being exposed to intense fire. I suspect that the Indians took some of our men captive, and when reinforcements later joined us, we discovered what appeared to be human remains, along with fragments of blue uniforms, indicating that the men had been bound to stakes and trees. The bodies of several officers, including Lieutenants Harrington, Porter, and others, were never found, or at least not at that time. Many of the deceased were unable to be identified during the burial process. Following the Indians' departure from our line of sight, we emerged from our defensive positions, constructed improved rifle pits, and unsaddled our horses, which had remained saddled since the evening of the 24th. The respite allowed us to tend to our exhausted mounts and bolster our defenses, preparing for any potential future engagements. We proceeded to remove the packs from the mules, and then fetched water from the river in camp kettles. We also constructed a more substantial shelter for the horses and wounded, anticipating another potential attack from the Indians. The severity of the engagement was evident in the significant losses suffered by Reno's command, with approximately 45 men killed and 60 wounded between the skirmish in the bottomland and the entrenchments on the bluffs. In my company alone, out of 45 men and horses that entered the fray, 14 men and our second lieutenant were killed, 10 were wounded, and we lost around 15 horses, either killed or disabled. That night, an eerie silence prevailed, with no signs of Indian activity. At dawn the following morning, we gazed out from the bluffs towards the Indian camp, observing that it had been abandoned, save for the standing lodge poles. In the distance, a considerable cloud of dust arose, heralding the approach of either Indian forces or troops towards the deserted camp. While initially uncertain, some officers, utilizing their field glasses, surmised that the approaching party consisted of troops. Reno promptly dispatched scouts to investigate, and they confirmed that the newcomers were indeed the remaining elements of our expedition, accompanied by General Gibbon's command under General Alfred Terry. It transpired that Terry's forces had traversed Custer's battlefield, tallying 207 deceased soldiers. They then crossed the river, entering the abandoned Indian camp, and proceeded up the Little Bighorn Valley until they reached the site where Reno's dead lay. Halting near the bend where Reno's command had retreated across the river, they established camp. General Terry and his officers rode across the river to join our officers on the bluffs, and their arrival filled our hearts with joy. Upon receiving news from Terry's officers regarding the discovery on the Custer battlefield, Reno's command promptly set to work, interring the deceased on the bluffs. The unexpected tidings filled the hearts of all the men with profound sorrow. We gathered the excess firearms belonging to the deceased and wounded, broke their stocks, and consigned them to a fiery pyre. Similarly, we destroyed surplus saddles and bridles, as we lacked the means to transport them. Terry's men carefully conveyed our wounded down from the bluffs to their camp, after first removing their clothing. Following the destruction of the guns, we meticulously examined the horses, euthanizing those mortally wounded to prevent further suffering. Some men found it difficult to part with their equine companions, but circumstances dictated this course of action. 5 companies of Reno's command then proceeded across the range of bluffs toward the Custer battlefield. At the terminus of this bluff, a ford existed, and it is believed that Custer attempted to cross at this point to reach the Indian camp, as we discovered the bodies of his men lying there. These were the first bodies we encountered belonging to Custer's command. When Benteen's battalion joined Reno on the bluffs, 5 companies commenced a movement along the ridge in the direction Custer had taken, toward the Custer battlefield, from which we could observe the terrain. Here, Reno's command was attacked by the Indians, and we received orders to fall back to the location of our packs and wounded. Regarding Curley, a Crow scout, it appears that he managed to escape during the initial stages of Custer's engagement. According to accounts, Curley mingled with the Sioux during the battle and, seizing an opportunity, exchanged his Crow blanket for a Sioux one. He then made his way to the underbrush, where he secured his pony, taking measures to prevent the animal from making noise or fleeing. Curley, the Crow scout, seized a Sioux pony and fled down the Little Bighorn, pursued by the Indians, yet managing to evade capture. He subsequently reported to General Terry, recounting the events of the engagement. In illustrating the battle, Curley employed a unique method, mimicking the sound of gunfire and then simulating death by dropping his makeshift gun and throwing up his hands. He explained this gesture to General Terry, signifying the demise of the soldier who had fired the gun. General Terry provided Curley with a piece of paper and a lead pencil, upon which Curley created a rudimentary diagram. He marked the soldiers' positions within a circular formation, surrounded by the Indians. When queried about the number of casualties, Curley gathered a handful of leaves and scattered them upon the paper, declaring, "The white men are all dead, and the Indians as thick as leaves." Although the tale seemed incredulous and was initially met with skepticism, it ultimately proved accurate in every detail. Curley claimed to have foreseen the troops' impending massacre and, seizing an opportunity, escaped by washing off his Crow paint, altering his hairstyle, donning a Sioux blanket, and feigning participation in the battle alongside the Sioux. During one of their charges against Custer, he exploited the chaos to escape, appropriating a Sioux pony and reporting to the mouth of the Little Bighorn, where he anticipated General Terry's arrival on the evening of the 26th. Captain Benteen's actions warrant the highest praise. His timely interventions proved instrumental in rescuing Reno's command from the brink of total destruction. With unwavering gallantry, he cleared the ravines of Indian forces, thereby securing a vital passage to the river, which enabled the provision of water to our suffering wounded. In Captain Benteen, Reno found a trusted ally, whose counsel and support proved indispensable in the midst of chaos. Benteen's bravery and leadership were a beacon of hope, and his contributions to the survival of Reno's command cannot be overstated. Dr. Porter found himself in the midst of the most intense fighting during the chaotic retreat of Reno's men as they desperately sought to reach the ford ahead of their relentless Indian pursuers. Amidst the tumultuous scramble, with officers and soldiers hastily passing one another, Dr. Porter witnessed the exceptional bravery of Lieutenant Mathy. Upon reaching the crest of the hill, Mathy swiftly constructed a makeshift barricade using the carcasses of dead animals, commissary supplies, and medical stores from the pack mules. This impromptu fortification provided a sanctuary for the wounded, whose numbers rapidly swelled from 10 to 52. Dr. Porter expressed his deepest admiration for Lieutenant Matthey's prompt actions, which undoubtedly saved numerous lives. Dr. Porter also extolled the virtues of Fred Gerard, who assisted him in performing a couple of critical amputations and provided invaluable support throughout the battle. Gerard, possessing medical knowledge rivaling only Dr. Porter's, proved an indispensable asset to the command. The loss of medical personnel was a severe blow, with Dr. Lord falling alongside General Custer's command and Dr. Dowolf succumbing to his wounds on the hillside during Reno's retreat. I hope this first-hand account gives you a new perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Stay tuned for more videos like this. I hope to bring you more first-hand accounts of different battles, so have a great day, and I'll see you next time.